Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Tino Cuellar, President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I'm thrilled to see that so many of you have decided not to go to Davos today. For those of us who are reflecting on the world as we survey what is happening in Davos and in the rest of the world, it is inescapable to be thinking on, reflecting on the role of the United States in the world. And that is what you're going to hear about today. American power, the role of the United States in the world, how the United States plays a certain role, has a certain set of values. But I want to start not by focusing on the present, but instead by going back 20 years. In 2006, our colleagues over at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations decided that they were going to do a poll, and they were going to ask Americans how they thought about American primacy and how long they thought American primacy would last. At the time, 4 in 10 Americans thought that somewhere along the line, in 50 years, there might be another country that is as powerful as the United States, and only 16% said that within 50 years it was at least possible that another nation would surpass the United States in power and influence around the world. Fast forward to the present. In a Carnegie poll that you will hear more about today with our distinguished panelists, we have a very different picture. In this poll, 2/3 of Americans think that China's power equals or exceeds that of the United States. 47% of respondents believe that China is already ahead or will be within 5 years. Now, I know that you know that polls are not a guide necessarily to policy or to what's absolutely true in the world. But if we live in a democracy, it is powerful and important to understand where is the public? How are they thinking about their role in the world, about their country's role in the world? And crucially, are there gaps potentially between the way the public thinks about something and the way decision makers, folks we might call foreign policy elites, think about the world? And let's take Latin America, Western Hemisphere, just to think for a minute about how this kind of polling sheds light on the world. So this administration is certainly acting in a manner that suggests that the Western Hemisphere is a real priority for them. Where are Americans? Well, at least according to this poll, they have a somewhat different perspective when it comes to the Western Hemisphere and the level of importance it has relative to other challenges, other regions, other opportunities that the U.S. has. Today, we are taking a deep dive into these questions about American power, the role of the U.S. in the world, public opinion, where America is going. This is a topic that is of profound importance to my institution and to all of you and to all of us. But it is only one part of a broader initiative Carnegie has called Beyond Disruption, which we are formally launching today. In fact, Beyond Disruption is an apt title because the world is subject to a great many disruptions. The war in Ukraine, changes in American foreign policy, changes in technology, changes in geopolitics. We will be taking a very deep dive and looking closely at how global problem solving works in a world that is more multipolar, more fragmented, more contesting of certain things, including American power, perhaps. We will be watching and studying closely how science and technology are reshaping security, both economic security and national security. But a crucial pillar, and in fact the one that is furthest along in our work, thanks in no small measure to Chris Chivvis, who heads our American Statecraft program, is the pillar focusing on the nature of American power. What is it? Where does it come from? How might it be used? How will it play out differently in the world? So today, I'm delighted that we have a terrific panel. Couldn't think of a better panel because, of course, there are 2 Carnegie people on it and one terrific moderator. We have Chris Chivvis, formerly of the RAND Corporation and our head of our American Statecraft program, who is leading the first pillar of Beyond Disruption, focusing on American power. Stephen Wertheim, a senior fellow in our American Statecraft program, prolific, thoughtful, provocative. And then to moderate, we have Amy McKinnon, who has probably the most interesting job in journalism because it's her job to think about Europe for the Financial Times. So thank you, all 3 of you, and thank you to all of you for being part of this with us.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I mentioned this to you earlier, Chris, but I'm encouraged that your new project is called Beyond Disruption, the implication being that the disruption will at least come to an end at some point.
Like I said, one must make assumptions when doing analysis.
Right, right. And I can't think of a more timely topic to discuss today than looking at the foreign policy opinions of Americans. With Davos happening today, the president in Davos, and the real kind of the bubble of the bubble gathering to talk about politics and the global economy, I think it's an interesting counterbalance to actually take a moment to look at what do Americans think of foreign policy. Where do they see America's role in the world, and where is that headed? And I'm really excited to dive into this with you both today. As we are here to discuss your poll findings, and some of which I think are really interesting and surprising, I want to give you both a moment to kind of set the scene and give a summary of what struck you as most interesting or most surprising, or what was kind of where you expected to be in these polls. Chris, maybe we could start with you on this.
Great. In fact, to answer that, I think a good thing to do would be to take one of these slides, if you could put that up for us. Fantastic, thank you. So this is one of our top line findings here, Amy. In this poll where we were looking at how Americans understand American power in the world, one of the most striking things that we learned, and one of the most basic that we learned, is that most Americans do not believe that the United States is the most powerful country in the world. They believe that it is one of several powerful nations. In other words, the vision that Americans have of the world today is one that is pluralistic and even multipolar. And I think this has really interesting implications for how our political leaders think about foreign policy and think about selling foreign policy to the American people. So I look forward to talking about that. I'll just add one other here, which is that we looked a lot at how Americans think about American power versus China's power, because that's something that we obviously talk about a lot here in Washington, D.C. And we found that nearly half of Americans said that China is already more powerful than America or will be within the next 5 years. And so this is also a very striking finding when you think about how American citizens view America's role in the world.
Stephen, to you, what struck you, or what were your kind of top line takeaways from this survey?
Great. So I've got some slides of my own too. Didn't come empty-handed. So Chris spoke about the questions that we asked about the amount of power the United States has in the world. We also asked questions about how important American power was to Americans. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. First of all, our findings showed by a supermajority, Americans want the United States to have power and influence in the world. That was a supermajority finding. So the evidence for so-called isolationism among the American public, that just wasn't there. But a number of things did surprise us, certainly surprised me. And one of them was this. A majority of Americans did not think that there would be a big change in their lives if China were to surpass the United States in power and influence. A few said somehow that their lives would get a little bit better, but in fact, the single most common answer, 54%, was my life would be made neither better nor worse if China were to have more power than the United States. Only 14% said that their life would get much worse, a very small number. I suspect that if we took a survey of folks in Washington who work on these issues, we'd get a higher number than 14%. So this does suggest a disconnect in my mind, and maybe suggests that the kind of price that the American public as a whole would be willing to pay to keep China from surpassing the United States in power and influence wouldn't be very high. Now, of course, in specific scenarios like a Taiwan conflict, more would be at stake than just this sort of abstraction about Chinese power versus American power. But nevertheless, I think it's a surprising finding. We also asked Americans to assess how important they thought it was to themselves and their future that the United States have power in particular regions. There's been a lot of discussion in this town for a while about a pivot to Asia. People within the Trump administration have advocated a clear prioritization on Asia, certainly some voices in the Pentagon. This administration also has put renewed emphasis on the Western Hemisphere. What we found, first of all, is that Americans thought that each region that's been significant in American foreign policy for many decades was important for the United States to have power in. Even Africa, which was the outlier, the one that had lower numbers, still a majority of Americans said it was either somewhat or very important for the United States to have power and influence there. But really, none of the other regions stood out above each other, with the exception of North America, where, of course, the mainland United States is located. So Asia did not have a higher number in terms of power, the importance that Americans ascribe to American power, than Europe, than the Middle East. And Central and South America also did not stand out above those other regions, even as support for American power and influence in all of those regions was significant, well over a majority.
So you mentioned this in terms of the answer on China and what it would mean for the lives of Americans if China were to surpass the United States. But looking at this survey more broadly, who do you think is right about who has the more clear-eyed assessment of America's place in the world and its trajectory? The public and your survey respondents, or kind of the foreign policy people who work in this sphere in Washington? Oh, Stephen, I feel like you might enjoy that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be fair, the question we asked was an abstract question. And on some dimensions of power, China may already rank above the United States. We could debate technology. So, I would actually tend toward where the public seemed to be in terms of, sheer advantages for China affecting people's lives in a direct way, certainly relative to where we are. But of course, a whole range of policy issues are more specific than that. So I don't want to overread the results of our poll. So, if we had asked about Taiwan, for example, if we had asked about trade issues, those may be different kinds of answers.
I just wanted to add, I think, with these kinds of polls, I mean, obviously foreign policy experts here in Washington have got technical knowledge that, most Americans do not have. That's why we have foreign policy experts. We need that kind of technical knowledge. So with certain types of questions, what the American public thinks may not be a good guide for what we should do. But with broad questions like this, we live in a democracy. And our political leaders, if they're going to pursue policies, for example, say the defense of Taiwan, say the defense of Ukraine, they need to know what the American public is willing to support. You already raised the question of, at least implicitly, of competition with China. Is competition with China something that the American public is going to be willing to pay an open-ended price for indefinitely? Or is it something where, yeah, the American public cares about, the United States being powerful in Asia, but not necessarily maintaining primacy at all costs? Those are important things for our political leaders to pay attention to.
That was something I wanted to touch on. I mean, looking at, as you said, the survey seems to suggest that the ceiling might be lower in terms of what Americans would currently accept when it comes to competing with China. If you were a U.S. policymaker right now or in a future administration, how would you look at that? How would that shape? Does that shape policy choices, or does it shape your messaging choices about conveying to the American public why this is important strategically?
I think obviously both matter, and this doesn't. You can't get from a poll like this sort of the answer of exactly how much the American public is willing to tolerate or how far it will go, and views will change. I mean, if there were a crisis over Taiwan, you might take this poll and you might get more, or maybe you get less support for competition with China. But it is a reminder that there are limits on what the American public is willing to do. If you think about, for example, the experiences that the United States had in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think we saw that there was a lag between how the American public was viewing the cost of those wars and where the policy elite here in Washington was in terms of its belief in their importance, its investment in their success, and that created, you could argue, quite a lot of problems for our society and politics.
Stephen, on this finding that nearly 3/4 expect China to overtake the US in power and influence in the near future, do you think that is a reflection of the reality, or is that a reflection of 10 plus years of warnings by US policymakers that China is the new major strategic rival?
It's a good question. I do think there's a lot of talk in our political discourse that actually talks down the power of the United States. Tends to be that the people, the opposition party talks down the power, and then the party that has the White House talks up American power. So the Biden administration left office in his last year really touting how American power was ascendant, actually. And Trump said just the opposite, and now, American powers have never been more powerful before, and once we have Greenland, we'll be even more powerful. So
That was a joke, I think.
it was a joke.
Record, yeah.
It's really good that he's here to point that out. So, I think the assessment of relative power between the United States and China, though, is one really surprised me from this poll, because I think the United States continues to have considerable advantages along most dimensions of power relative to China. Interestingly enough, when you go into some of the more detailed results, we asked respondents to name areas of advantage in which China had the edge over the United States. Technology was the only one where they said China had an edge over the United States, which also I wouldn't necessarily say myself. So there may be like a gap between when people think about the specific areas of Chinese power, they then realize that the United States remains more formidable, but when they are asked the overall comparative question, they may feel not so good about where the United States is, and possibly that changes their assessment of where we stand relative to China in a kind of larger sense.
And what are the implications of that, particularly for business and for industry, if there is a perception that the US is already falling behind China?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's obviously difficult choices for industry to make about the extent to which they're going to remain economically intertwined with China. On the whole, I think our poll results kind of suggest that President Trump's demotion of the China threat from his overall political narrative and his attempt to broker some sort of truce, we're in a kind of moment of a trade truce with China, is something that has a bit more political support among the general public than one might have expected from having these kinds of conversations in Washington.
Chris, I wanted to come back to the kind of the broader project that this is the kind of the beginning of. I mean, what made you kind of launch this survey now, and where are you hoping to take these findings?
Sure. Thanks for asking. I mean, I think as Tino said at the outset of this event, I mean, we're living in a I will not be the first to say this today, let alone this year, let alone this presidential administration. We are living in a period of enormous uncertainty that is being created by the foreign policy of the world's most powerful country. I think the challenge is, as analysts, right, we still have a duty, we have a role to think about constructively about what the United States could do better, how the world could respond to the change that's being created. And so given that, regardless of whether the United States is one of a handful of powerful countries or whether it is the world's most powerful country, it still matters enormously to world order. And so trying to think about not just the quantity of power that America has and will have in a few years, but also to think about the quality of the power. What are the areas in which America has more power than in the past? What are the areas in which it has less power? And frankly, to think about how the era that we are living through right now is going to affect that equation is something that we all need to be doing, and I'm glad to be doing it in this project here at Carnegie.
I'm going to pause now to remind our audience, both in the room here and online, that I will be taking audience questions towards the end of this. So please get thinking about your questions for our guests here and about their poll and what it says about America's role in the world. There were some interesting differences between party affiliation in the survey results. And on the question of the singularity of American power, most Democrats, 71%, saw the United States as one powerful country amongst others. In contrast, most Republicans, 61%, took the opposite view, saying that the US is still the single most powerful nation. The idea that the politics stops at the water's edge has long since ebbed. But I wondered, reading this, do you think this suggests that we could continue to see turbulence between Republican and Democratic administrations if they're on different pages about America's standing in the role relative to its near peers?
Sure. I think, yes. I think the short answer is yes. I think that I've wondered about that finding. I think that, some might argue that it is a reflection of who is in the White House right now, and that, there is anxiety among Democrats about the damage that President Trump appears to be doing to some forms of American power, whereas there may be more confidence among Republicans that his very aggressive foreign policy is actually making the United States stronger. I don't think that explains entirely the divergence that you just cited. I think there really are some different views about the world that we are living in between Democrats and Republicans that will make it difficult for the United States, difficult but not impossible for the United States to pursue a consistent foreign policy in the mid-21st century.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, actually. My reading of the poll is that it suggests that party leaders have been misaligned with their party's rank and file. So President Biden, touted the indispensability of American power in perhaps his most important foreign policy address in October 2023. He went back to Madeleine Albright at the height of the unipolar moment, said we are the indispensable nation, and American power and American alliances are what holds the world together. And yet Democrats in our poll, a strong majority of them thought the United States was one power among other several, one powerful country among several, as opposed to the most powerful. Mm-hmm. By contrast, President Trump has said different things at different times about America's standing in the world, most of it revolving around whether he's president or not. But he's often presented the United States as a crippled country, a third world country. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a year ago after taking office, described the world as a multipolar world in which there were multiple great powers that the United States had to contend with, and yet Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to say that the United States is the singular powerful country in the world. That's
interesting. So Biden and Trump both kind of being a little bit out of step with maybe where their voters are at least based on this poll.
It seems like it, and I would say our results on the whole suggest that there is space for an alternative that's neither Biden's attempt to restore American indispensability nor Trump's disruption that the American public as a whole would be receptive to, one that acknowledges that the United States faces quite formidable competitors and rivals, and yet is going to maintain a powerful role in the world. It just doesn't need to be the most powerful.
On the question, you looked at the second part of your analysis, looked at the importance of American power to voters. And 3/4 of respondents said that it is either very or somewhat important to them that the US has power and influence around the globe. This would seem to be in contrast to the restraint-oriented, or some would say isolationist-oriented position of President Trump and his administration. I mean, what do you make of that disconnect? Stephen,
Sure,
would you
sorry.
go first?
Go ahead, Stephen,
Yeah, I don't think President Trump is pursuing a restraint-oriented foreign policy. I don't think he's ever been an isolationist. I also think that the poll results don't suggest that the public is averse to more restraint in foreign policy than we've seen in recent decades. The question you cited asked about, how important it is to Americans and their future that the United States have power and influence in the world. It didn't say that the United States be the single most powerful country, and as we can see from our results, most Americans actually think the United States is more like one among several powerful countries than the most powerful. So, people who have been associated with the restraint school of thought, myself included, I think almost all of us support the United States being not only a great power, but a power with commitments, at least in Asia, that endure. I would add more to that, but that seems like a baseline. And the United States, I think, would be the most powerful country. It just wouldn't be pursuing the bid for primacy in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia simultaneously, as it has since the end of the Cold War. So I think that's consistent with the results that we got in the poll, but also, we didn't poll those specific strategic formula, so I wouldn't say that the poll, conclusively endorses one school of thought or another.
Chris, I want to speak about this slide we have up on the screen here, actually, because I thought this was a really fascinating finding when you asked about, what is the most important kind of area of the world to maintain power and influence. North America, understandably, comes out on top, but then there's a remarkably even balance between Middle East, Europe, Central and South America, and Asia, with only Africa being slightly lower at 23%. And this comes after pivot to Asia, 2 decades of war in the Middle East, Trump's renewed focus on the Western Hemisphere. I mean, what did you take away from this?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think so, especially if you look at all of the blue area here, and maybe we're reading down from the top to the bottom of the slide just to orient our viewers. All of those 4 regions in the Middle East, Europe, Central, South America, and Asia, are all at around 70% of people saying that it is either very important or somewhat important that the United States maintain power and influence in these regions. So, that is a significant show of support for American engagement abroad, which I think is something that is important to note. In terms of the differences between them, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to be learned from this. One thing you pointed to is that Asia is no more important, according to most Americans, than the Middle East, Europe, or Central and South America, and that would be in contrast to what I think has been the tendency here within the Beltway over the course of the last decade, which is to really focus on the pivot to Asia, to focus on China, to say that this is the most important foreign policy challenge that the United States faces. By the same token, take Europe. Europe is of significant importance, and one thing that's not evident from this slide is that actually it turned out to be more important to Republicans that the United States maintain power and influence in Europe than to Democrats, not by a huge margin, but by a noticeable margin, which makes you wonder about what President Trump is doing right now with his Greenland policy, whether or not that's something that's going to be viewed positively by Republicans or negatively, because it certainly is creating an enormous amount of friction between the United States and Europe.
There was also some interesting generational divides in the findings of the polls. A majority of Americans 45 and older, among them 50% deemed U.S. global power to be very important, but amongst millennials and Gen Z, so those under 45, only 38% shared this view. Not a huge gulf between those generations, but certainly distinct. I mean, what does this tell you, as researchers, as scholars, kind of looking into this, about this new and emerging generation of American leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great that you raised this, and this slide is not here, but it's in the report, which is available online. And we found similar findings in an earlier report that we did on Gen Z views on foreign policy. Look, the younger generation here, Gen Z, this is the generation that's going to be shaping our foreign policy as leaders in government, in business, media over the course of the next 50 years. So what that generation thinks is really important. And as you see, again, this is in the online version, but not right here. They are the most acceptant or of the mind that the United States is one of several powerful countries in the world. So the mindset is just different for people who have grown up entirely in the 21st century, didn't live through the Cold War or the early post-Cold War period of extreme American hyperpower.
Mm-hmm. As we are in a major election year, I'm curious, I mean, you've both worked in Washington and know the city very well. How much does public opinion on things like foreign policy factor into elections, and particularly midterms?
It rarely is a key factor, but sometimes there are particular issues that matter to Americans. When we had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, those factored in. Maybe not so much in midterm elections, but in presidential elections, the story that the president tells about what America should be in the world resonates with their overall story about their leadership. And I think that matters as well. It's pretty difficult, given how quickly events are moving, to know at this point where the public will be on foreign policy and how the midterms will invoke foreign policy or not. So I'd be surprised if it's a sort of top of mind issue. Well, one thing that has struck me over the past 6 months is that President Trump has, first of all, has used military force much more assertively than you might have expected from his rhetoric on the campaign trail, where he was the person who was saying, we want to bring wars to an end. And when he's done so, from an operational perspective, he's been pretty successful. Operation Midnight Hammer in Iran didn't lead to huge escalation that people feared. The raid to capture Nicolas Maduro recently, again, in operational terms, very successful. The polling results are not great from the public. I don't think Trump is, people are not coming out into the streets by any stretch. But given how successful in narrow operational terms these missions were against, adversarial countries, they have not inspired a great deal of support amongst the American public, and the story is also not over in terms of what kind of blowback the United States could experience, whether it's in Iran, Venezuela, or elsewhere.
No, I was just going to say, I think, these foreign policy issues tend not to matter a lot, other than in the sense that Stephen was saying, that they are a way in which leaders can project a certain personality and character, and we obviously see President Trump doing a lot of that. But they do matter when things go badly, and I think the jury is still out on what's going to happen in Venezuela. Are we going to have sustained peace in the Middle East? How bad are things going to get with Europe? Will Europe retaliate in ways that really do harm to the American economy? That's something that would have a real political effect.
So I think I'm now going to go to audience questions. Please raise your hand, and are there microphones? Yes, okay. There's microphones that will make their way around the room, and we have another question over here for next. And if you just please state your name and your affiliation.
Michelle McManus with the American Committees on Foreign Relations. I'm just curious on how you do your polling, and if you poll people from the heartland at the Midwest and not on the coasts.
So the organization that we partnered with on this is YouGov, and they have a representative panel of American citizens. So there's a broad geographical representation, rural, urban, different ages, different political affiliations. It's considered one of the polls that is one of the panels that is most frequently used for polls of this kind.
And there's another question, sir, here.
Thank you. Benjamin Wyman. I'm a master's student at the School of International Service at AU. My question is relating to the possible broader signaling the erosion of U.S. influence among traditional allies. Mark Carney recently was in Beijing, and then he had some very choice words at Davos as well, kind of regarding the New World Order. Obviously, the EU suspension of the U.S. and new European trade deal and trade agreement and their tariff disputes over Greenland. How do you see this kind of shaping and possibly reshaping American public perceptions internally, and what implications do you think this might have?
It's a great question. It's hard to say. I think our polling results suggest that the sort of reflex that people who have been in the foreign policy community in Washington might have to say, you know, Trump is squandering American leadership, American influence, that may not have the traction that they might assume. I don't think people want American leadership or influence to be squandered, but they may look at other countries making arrangements for themselves and think that may make sense for them. It's not necessarily a loss for us. So, you know, we should avoid simplistic assumptions. On the other hand, Trump has, first of all, he's put a lot of emphasis on foreign policy. He has basically announced to the world and the country, I'm a foreign policy president. I'm the president of peace, maybe now not so much peace. But nevertheless, so he is susceptible to the message that he used against his opponents, which was, you know, we have urgent needs at home. Why are you doing these things abroad that often don't succeed anyway and are detracting from the actual needs of the American public? So I think that's a vulnerability to him. And a question that I have is, I mean, President Trump legitimates his foreign policy in a totally different way from what we've seen before. He thinks, you know, instead of making it sound like we're bringing democracy to Venezuela, he wants to make it sound like we're taking the oil from Venezuela. So this kind of imperialistic legitimation, we just haven't seen in foreign policy in the United States historically. You know, maybe sometimes it's there in the margins, but the rhetoric tends to be about, you know, win-wins and preserving a good global order. What the country makes of this, I can't profess to know, but if the past is a guide, for example, the sort of blowback that the Nixon-Kissinger advocacy of realpolitik generated, that's sort of how we get the flourishing of a human rights and neoconservative movement in the 1970s, you know, that suggests that the American public may be somewhat tolerant of Trump's rationale for a while, but not if the costs visibly mount. And they may also ask, okay, we were tired of the alternative, but what are we actually getting, and who are we as a country in the world if we're a country that wants to take the oil or take Greenland, et cetera?
I actually want to piggyback on the first question about when and how you ran the survey. I mean, this ran late November, early December. We're living in an era where foreign policy is changing rapidly. sometimes by the hour, it feels like. I mean, in the interim, since this survey was, I mean, I know you focused on the big strategic questions about America's role in the world, competition with China, but since the survey ran, we've had the operation against Maduro, we've had Trump's renewed and kind of extended threats against Greenland. It looked last week like we were coming to the brink of striking Iran again. Do you expect, if you ran this survey again next week, that the results would be slightly different? Do you think that would be reflected in people's answers?
I think it would be a really interesting experiment because the question is whether or not those actions are perceived as making the United States stronger or weaker. And obviously you have two big discussions out there, right? I mean, Trump, I assume, is doing this because he thinks it makes at least him look strong, and it plays to his idea of, you know, a country that needs to act and be stronger in the world. But obviously there are many counter arguments to be made to that, and important ones that say that actually, and this gets to the core of the project that we're doing here, that this is actually going to make the United States weaker over the long run because of the loss of important international relationships, the potential for example, chaos in Venezuela, and a range of other factors. So it'd be interesting to see, but I don't actually know whether or not Americans would, if you did this same poll, say that the United States had become stronger or not.
Mm-hmm. We're getting some great questions coming in. I'll go to one online, and then we'll come to you next, sir. We have one from Charlie Reese. Apologies if I'm pronouncing your last name incorrectly. They ask whether you got a sense as to whether the American public prefers soft or hard power in pursuing its foreign policy objectives.
That's a great question. We didn't ask that question in a targeted way. I mean, we did have some indication when we asked what are the areas in which you think that the United States is ahead of China, and we had the indication that there was this concern that China has pulled ahead in terms of technology. There wasn't a deep concern that China was ahead militarily, which I think, you know, certainly if you look globally would probably be an accurate depiction. But we didn't ask a specific question about soft power, so that's definitely something that we'll add to the list for the future.
I mean, is there a word you could use to summarize your findings in this? I mean, to me, I was struck by the responses were quite moderate. But I'm curious if you have if there's a singular word that comes to mind for you.
I'm not sure, but I think I agree with moderate in a way. It did not, I would say it's discordant with what we're seeing from President Trump. The results that we got did not suggest that the public is completely fed up with America's role in the world and wants to see a whole lot of things broken and find out what the results are. So, you know, that's why I'm very curious about how Trump's own conduct in office, given how different it seems a year in from how he conducted himself on the campaign, how it's all going to go down. Although I have to admit, as we've discussed, unless there are visible costs from foreign policy actions, foreign policy hasn't risen to the fore in political campaigns.
I would pick realistic as the word, at least from my perspective. I think what we see here are a large number of Americans who recognize that the world changes and evolves, and that naturally America will also change and evolve with it, and that it is unrealistic to expect that through acts of willpower, the United States can maintain a position against structural forces in the world polity and economy.
I think we had a question down here, sir.
Can I hold it? Oh, you want to hold it? Okay, sorry. Jaspreet Talwar, former U.S. ambassador to Morocco. And I had a question following the last one regarding whether you were able to find a sense of how and who the United States should go about engaging in the world. I recall back in the '80s, after Iraq and Afghanistan, the public was really thought we had gone too far, both parties, in terms of military intervention, and there was a very strong support for engaging adversaries, for example. And if you look at President Trump's foreign policy in the first term, this term, there's really no ideological opposition on his part to engaging adversaries. So North Korea, Iran, even this administration, a conversation with Hamas, signing an agreement with the Taliban in the first administration. And I'm just wondering if, and that seemed to align at least with that sentiment, from 17 years ago. The question is whether that sentiment still persists or whether we've sort of moved beyond that phase.
It's a really important question. And the short answer is we did not ask the specific question that you are pointing to about whether or not the United States should be selective about who it engages with based upon the nature of the regime of the other side. But I do think, and I'm interpreting some here, that insofar as Americans see the United States as one powerful country among many, that does imply that diplomacy is going to be, or that they expect diplomacy and negotiation to be an important part of American statecraft. And if you take that premise, then I think the answer is yes, Americans are again, this is, there is a large number of Americans who are open to the possibility of negotiating, including with regimes that are different from America's own.
Yeah, I would just add that our results on China, I think, also corroborate what Chris was saying. We also know from a Pew survey conducted last spring that the number of Americans who think China is an adversary as opposed to a competitor and other options dropped well below 40%. That suggests if it's not a thing that would make your life much, much worse, if China were to surpass the United States in influence, if China is viewed by most of the public as something other than an adversary, that diplomacy would be warranted. And we've seen, very unconventional presidents, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, from two different parties since the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the launching of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. One of the things that Obama and Trump have had in common, as I think your question alluded to, is that they were very clear that they wanted to do diplomacy with anybody, with American adversaries, without necessarily preconditions. And that's just part of what the United States should be doing in its repertoire of statecraft. It's something that a lot of people have disagreed with in Washington, but that seems to be a pretty robust through line, and one that the public seems amenable to.
We're getting some good questions about online from viewers about again about the way the survey was run. Somebody's asking, they didn't leave their name. To what extent did the data indicate differences in opinion between views from various people with varied educational backgrounds? And I would maybe add to that again, did you get a sense of any geographical differences in the answers? Were you able to drill down that much?
We did not. No, we did not. I mean, I think if you could go through the data again, you could look at it from that angle. Mm-hmm. It is in there on some level, but we didn't do that particular analysis with this. But it would be an interesting set of questions to ask, certainly. Yeah.
Certainly. So I think I will just add one more of my own, unless there's any in the room. I will indulge. I mean, going back to the question about China, I mean, I think that was for me one of the most interesting kind of headline takeaways here, is that that difference between what we hear here in the Beltway versus how Americans see the China threat. Would you be concerned if you were a U.S. policymaker that the public does not seem to align with where Washington is on the China competition? And to what extent? I mean, I suppose there are different questions. Would your life be radically different if China overtook the U.S. versus would you like to live in a Chinese-led global order, which is, I think, how the question is often framed in Washington. Stephen, what you're nodding along.
I'd just be more concerned that policymakers in Washington will assume that they can lead the country somewhere that it doesn't want to go. Americans are hearing plenty of people in Washington say that China is a key threat, and they are where they are. So that would be my main concern. Now, I think, could they communicate better and make more efforts to talk to people about the challenges that China poses? Absolutely. But, at a certain point, we also have to understand the very real limits of what the United States might be willing to do, because that's a huge factor in our policymaking and the kind of commitments we make. So if you take, the case of a conflict over Taiwan, we face a situation of radical uncertainty as to how the United States would behave. Would people actually want to send U.S. military forces and engage in a war like that? It's a prospect that is very hard for all of us, I think, to really imagine in the way that we need to. But it is very relevant, because if the answer is no, when the time came, the American public would not be willing to bear very significant costs to fight a war with China over Taiwan, then that should incline us to be more limited in the kind of commitments that the United States makes to come to Taiwan's defense, and perhaps do more to spur Taiwan itself to be able to take the lead in a defense against the PRC, should it ever come to that, God forbid.
Yeah, 33%, I think, not in this poll, but in other polls, is the number of Americans who say that they believe that the United States should use military force to support Taiwan in a conflict, which is significantly lower than you would think based upon the way that discussion takes place here in Washington, D.C. Obviously, that poll could change as tensions with China grow or Taiwan is in the news more, but it's much lower, I think, than people assume. To your question about, whether or not Americans would like to live in a China-dominated world order, that is, of course, that's kind of a separate question from the one that we asked. There is a significant distance, at least in my mind, between saying China has surpassed the United States and we're living in a China-led global order where we have to adopt, CCP ways of life. I think if you were to ask that question, which is effectively, do you want the United States to become modeled on the CCP, I think you would get a very different kind of an answer. But there's a big distance. There's a big distance in there, both in terms of capacity, and some might even argue, well, maybe not intent, but certainly capacity of China to take whatever advantage it has now and turn it into that.
Well, I think on that note, I think we can wrap up. Unless, do either of you want to offer any final remarks about the survey and what next?
Only to please read the report itself, which is out now on the Carnegie website.
I will second that. I have read through it myself, and it's a fascinating read, and a lot more texture of the survey findings and the detail than we were able to get in here today. So definitely worth your time. Well, on that, then I will wrap up, and thank you so much to my guests, to Stephen and Chris, for sharing your insights today, and to everybody who's tuned in online to watch the discussion, and everyone here today. And thank you again for your thoughtful questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Amy.